Hello and good morning from New York City to all of our viewers. I am Sarah Jane Demy of Demy-Colton, and on behalf of the Demy-Colton team and our sponsor, Hogan Lovells, it is truly my pleasure to welcome you to the 33rd installment of the Demy-Colton Virtual Salons series. We welcome all of our past participants back, and of course, we welcome any of you who are new to the Virtual Salon series. Demy-Colton's mission is to convene healthcare industry leaders to catalyze change. And we do this through our in-person events such as BioFuture, Biotech Showcase, and our CEO Summits, one of which is taking place in 2 short months in Napa. And of course, through our virtual salon series, such as this one today. Today's salon is titled Future-Proofing: How to Prepare a Value-Based Market Access Strategy. This is the final salon in a 3-part series addressing U.S. market access strategy at the clinical stage for companies considering a launch. If you missed the first 2 sessions, you can access them on demand through our virtual salon page. And indeed, this particular salon is going to be recorded and it will be there as well. I urge you to take a look at them, to view them. They are truly information-packed and really important for any early stage biotech company considering a launch, as I noted before. Before we begin, I'd like to once again thank our sponsor, Hogan Lovells, for suggesting and sponsoring this series of salons. Some housekeeping notes before we get underway. We will begin with a 50 to 55-minute discussion period, followed by a Q&A session. Questions can be submitted in the Q&A pane below your screen, and we will try to address as many questions as possible. Once again, please note that the salon is being recorded and will be available later on today for viewing. Any additional materials, such as slides provided by our sponsor, are available to be downloaded in the Event Resources tab. Now, to our salon. Future-proofing: How to Prepare a Value-Based Market Access Strategy. I am pleased to introduce Alice Balder-Curran. She is a partner with Hogan Lovells, who is so well known in the market access space that she is known by one name, Alice. She will be joined by Michael Rothrock, who is president of Allegheny Strategy Partners, Peter Rubin, who is executive director of No Patient Left Behind, and Lowell Zeta, also a partner with Hogan Lovells. So with that said, Alice, the virtual podium is yours. I will join you later during the Q&A session. Take it over, Alice.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and our august group of panelists. If we go to slide 2, the question is, why are we talking about market access at the clinical stage? And this slide that you're looking at, we've used at the beginning of each of our 3 sessions. And the reason we look at market access at the clinical stage is because it is the most important factor in determining the long-term commercial success in the U.S. market. And importantly, and as many companies have already realized, thinking about market access needs to start not just a year before you launch or when you're in the middle of your phase 3s, but in some cases as early as your phase 1 trials. And when you are developing your target product profile, you need to look not just at the probability of technical and regulatory success, but also the probability of market access success. And we've heard from our panelists across all 3 sessions about how the most sophisticated investors and product developers are doing just that at as early as stage 1. That requires that you start looking at things like, who are your competitors going to be? What is your mechanism of action? What are your formulations? Is this a Part D versus a Part B product? How are you going to price it? Are you going to have differential pricing for differential dosing or different indications? And if you're wondering, what that is shorthand for, please go back and look at those materials that Sarah referenced, because we walk through that in the first session, why that matters, and in session 2, how in real terms it can impact the market access success of your product. What we're doing today is making sure you understand what you can do now while you're still developing a product to prepare for that market access success, even if it's years later, and really empower you and help you gain the confidence to understand the steps that you can take now, even if that market access success is several years away, and even recognizing that the market access environment could be very different by that time. So if you go to slide 3, this is what our 3 sessions have been about. The first 4 weeks ago was on the foundation, and that's where we walk through the basics of all the rules, commercial and legal, that address market access across the major payers in the US market. 2 weeks ago, we had session 2, and that's where we brought those to life. The idea was to take all of those foundational principles that we discussed in the first session and apply them to a hypothetical scenario to show what the drug developer could be doing, how an investor would look at it, how it could impact your clinical trial strategy, so that in real terms, using a real example, we could help the audience understand the different sort of interventions and plannings that you could be doing at the clinical stage to set you up for market access success. Today, we want to make that even more real by talking about what you could do today in terms of developing a managed care strategy for market access. That's what Michael will speak about momentarily. Then looking at the various tools that you can have with the FDA to develop data to support that market access success and a value-based strategy, including, and you can go to the next slide, including patient-reported outcomes and the data that you need for that, and companion diagnostics, which we've received a lot of questions about, and also confirmatory trials. And last but certainly not least, we'll hear from Peter Rubin, who will walk through an evolving description of how to measure value and getting away from the ways that the market looks like now, but also to consider additional broader spectrum means for evaluating and determining value so that you can position your product for success. So with that, we're going to move it over to Michael, who will walk you through a timeline for engaging with managed care payers, when you can engage with them, and what you should be prepared to talk about. With that, over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Alice, and good morning if you're on the East Coast. My name is Michael Rothrock, and I'm going to review for you and discuss best practices and timelines for how a manufacturer should engage with a payer. If we turn to slide 6, this kind of illustrates the different phases of your drug development and how it is going to be important for you as a manufacturer to really get in front of the certain payers, whether they're large national PBMs, large national insurance and health plans, to find what is actually going to be important for them to make your launch and your access as successful as possible. So let's start with phase 1, early development. So categories that are going to be important of interest to payers are going to be these orphan diseases, these rare disease drugs, gene therapies, oncology, things that do not have a lot of treatment options. They're potentially high budgetary expense. Pre-engagement is important for phase 1, where you and a payer could help potentially design topics around what is the unmet need, the trial design, a surrogate marker. Are there endpoints and outcomes that are important, which payers always are interested in outcomes, not just surrogate markers or symptom control? Can we design or align a diagnostic test as part of the FDA approval process to help understand this is the patient who will respond and who should be on your drug? So we get out in front, we have both parties at the table, we kind of decide what's important. So as you go through your developmental stages, you are kind of meeting or exceeding some of these thought processes that are aligned between both parties. As you go through phase 1, you want to continue to re-engage as they head into phase 2 and phase 3. Now,
so Michael, can I interrupt you there and ask you a question? I should have made sure that the audience understands your qualifications. You've had experience both with national and regional plans, as well as with PBMs, and being told, hey, for certain disease states, you actually may want to engage during phase 1 or around that time. Who do you reach out to? at the payer? Like, who's your point of contact, and who would they expect to speak with there?
Great question. So yes, my background has been over 25 years in the payer landscape, whether that's regional payers, national health plans, and PBMs for both commercial and Medicare Part D books of business. So you always want to make sure you start through your account management team, and that either the trade relations and or a pharmacy director or a medical director within that entity. So your account team, your market access team can be the quarterback to help facilitate these larger or more in-depth discussions. But you want to make sure you go through your standard point of contact within that payer. And they will help disseminate the right audience and the right key personnel who should be engaged at each of these touch points throughout this process.
Which raises the interesting point of, it assumes that you have a market access team when you're in phase one, and many don't. So has your experience been that companies with their first product do have those sorts of folks on their team that early?
You may not, but if you don't, then you have to make sure you get in touch with some of the medical directors and or pharmacy directors or a trade relations person. You can kind of scour out on the public domain who's at what organization to try to illustrate that you want to bring them in to be a partner to help develop this drug through the process, and to determine if they are receptive to getting these types of interactions and engagements aligned with you. There will be some payers and PBMs that will not. That's just not their model, or they have too much on their plate. But there will be some, and depending upon the disease state, that are going to be more interested and say, absolutely, I want to get ahead of this. I want to be part of this to make sure that if these things are done right, these are the types of drugs I need on my formulary.
Great. On to phase 2 and 3.
Thank you, Alice. So when we go to phase 2 and or 3, now we're starting to get to larger trials. And of course, with larger trials, we don't need to engage as early as we would in larger therapeutic area. As we would in smaller therapeutic areas. Here, we can start talking about other biologic and specialty categories, whether that is autoimmune, diabetes, cardiovascular, respiratory conditions, etc. These are the ones that payers already have a pretty good understanding around what the current treatment options are, the alternatives on the market today. So now we're really wanting to, again, understand what is going to be important. Surrogate versus outcomes. Are we going to be able to reduce ER visits, hospitalization rates, longer durability of benefit, sustained response? Here we might encourage more head-to-head data versus placebo-controlled trials. Here we want to understand where your location is going to be for your trial design, US, ex-US. Now again, the FDA will have a lot of input on the approval process there based on your manufacturing and your location sites. However, we'd like to know some of the US KOLs and subject matter experts are going to be included. And then finally, are we aligned on the number of patients and the length of the trial for each of these different diseases? So these are larger therapeutic areas, more understood by the large national payers and or PBMs. But now we're going to bring in new molecules, and we want to help align what could differentiate your drug to make it more valuable when it comes time for P&T and formulary approval. As mentioned here, once we have these things discussed on the front end, we now would want to re-engage after you have the data to see, did we meet the endpoints?
Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide and talk about the next phase, or definitely the phase 3 stage, or post phase 3, I should say.
So if we turn to slide 7, we've now talked about phase 1 study designs, rare, orphan, later line oncology disease states, gene therapy, because that is something that those are big ticket price options, big budgetary list price, annual cost. The phase 2 and 3, which we're now taking the funnel and getting to the larger therapeutic specialty categories and or primary care disease states, now getting to the part where this is post phase 3. Now we're going to go back to the table. We're going to re-engage with this payer and or PBM. and we're going to review and discuss the endpoints. We're going to then be cognizant about what is the patient journey for this disease, if we haven't already discussed this, meaning age of onset, time to diagnosis, alignment in therapy. Where does this drug fit? Is it a first line? Is it a second line? Is there a standard of care that's going to be viewed as a guideline approach before this drug we're talking about? The prior auth and utilization management discussions. We now are going to want to hear about list and net price goalpost here as to what we expect based on the endpoints that we've seen from your trial versus what we believe the market will bear from an affordability perspective. We're then going to talk about if there's truly some surrogate endpoints that are a little bit subjective. Are there value-based agreement opportunities that can help align to the endpoints if the cost of value is going to put that payer at risk? As we move down this page, post the trial endpoints, post the pricing discussions, post the value-based agreements, we now want to start discussing distribution options. Will it be through specialty pharmacy? Will it be a medical benefit? Will it be retail? If it is specialty pharmacy, we want to make sure if you're talking to one of the big three vertically integrated companies that we have access to the drug. It's important for us. There does offer value and formulary options there. So to get that drug endorsed and supported, it's important to have vertically integrated SPs in the network, if at all possible. We then also want to make sure we as a payer bring in the right financial constituents, whether that's a PBM actuary, whether that's a finance lead to help forecast budgetary impact per member per month, per member per year, and to help build it into pricing, whether that's premium or client forecasting. And then last but not least, if it's already in a competitive space or there is a reason to offer a rebate contract and or pricing considerations, these discussion points should be on the table at this point in time to hopefully level set expectations and versus reality when this drug finally gets FDA approved. Last but not least is the FDA approval date. Now we start the P&T time zero. The FDA approval date is what determines when the drug will go to the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee. Usually P&T committees are within 30 to 90 days post that FDA approval date. Here, we want to make sure we establish medical science liaison, maybe some KOL or SME presentations specifically to the clinicians at that PBM and payer. We want to finalize and look at, does your label and package insert mirror what we heard from you during the phase 3 data reports? And then finally, to ensure that there is the supply chain component outside of the P&T, the distribution and any other contracting options that are going to be plausible from you as a manufacturer to help ensure appropriate coverage at the right price.
So, Michael, I have a question. When we were on the prior slide and you said phase 2 or 3, you can go in and start having these conversations, it struck me that if you had those conversations then, by the time you get into the post phase 3, you at least are prepared, you have a sense of what the questions are or what the discussion or what the focus is going to be about the plan. So it at least would give the developer an opportunity to prepare, to not be caught cold, or just have a sense of how they need to frame their data because they have a better sense of the questions that they may be getting.
That's exactly right. You are, if we're at the point where we have the phase 2 or pre-phase 3 trials, and there's an alignment on what endpoints and or outcomes should be measured and how the trial should be designed, once we get to the post-phase 3 readout, now it's just looking at how did the drug perform.
And if you didn't do that, you'd have an answer for why you didn't do that at least, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So one of the questions we received ahead of time, and it touches a little bit on what you talked about, is what is the difference between a budget impact model and a value-based contract? And I heard you talk about budget, and I heard you talk about value-based. So do you have an answer to that question?
I do. I have two different answers for that one, actually. So we as PBM payer pharmacy directors, we don't need to see a budget impact model. We have actuaries and finance that will do this for us, because I've always seen budget impact models tell me it's only going to cost me 4 cents per member per month. Well, we want to understand your prevalence and incidence rates, your projected list and net pricing, the potential percent of lives per million that we may have within our population. We can then forecast the pricing ourselves. Yes, it might be nice to see it, but we don't really utilize a budget impact model with a lot of truth. We want to make sure we're aligned on the prevalence and incidence, the list and net price, and potential lives per million. We can forecast that ourselves. Now, a value-based agreement or an outcomes-based agreement, that is putting something at risk through a contractual relationship, whether that is a hospitalization rate, whether that is surrogate markers like lab tests, if they are collected, because not all lab tests are collected in data. And are we aligned on the outcome that is tangible, measurable, and reportable in the claims data? If they are, and they're all done within a 1 to no more than a 2-year period that we can measure this, then we're going to be more interested in entertaining a VBC or a VBA type of agreement. The reason it cannot be longer than 2 years is because of membership churn. Health plans, PBMs do see clients and membership churns every 2.5 to 3 years. So we can't make something measurable 5 years from time zero. We know we're not going to have that patient. So there are a lot of challenges with doing a VBA because we have to align on the outcome. We have to know it's reportable and verifiable within claims data. And we have to make sure the timeline is assessed within a period where we have that patient.
Terrific. I'm sure we've had some questions come in. We'll make sure and ask you them next up. But next up is Lowell Zeta, who's a partner of mine. And Lowell served as senior counselor to the FDA commissioner in the prior administration. And in that role, did a lot of different things, but that included looking at a lot of the cutting edge issues in the way the FDA would be involved in patient reported data, measuring value, companion diagnostics, and the like. So over to you, Lowell.
Thank you, Alice. I appreciate it. And thanks, Michael, for the discussion. Sort of tease up a couple of areas that I was hoping to pull thread on 3 key areas where I think is really critical for management and leadership to be aware of, and certainly, if applicable, to be sure they're integrated into your strategic plans. So starting with slide 9, is the first of the areas, patient-generated data and the use of digital tools in terms of data acquisition. And just to preview, the second category, second item is companion diagnostics, and the third is confirmatory trials. So I think that these areas just generally are really important, especially given the current state of the biotech market. And these 3 areas are very much evolving regulatory frameworks, along with some changes that we're watching really closely. As changes loom as user fee legislation progresses. So with slide 9, the focus here on slide 9 and 10 is patient-generated data. And as Michael was mentioning, as payers becoming more focused on outcomes, FDA and certainly industry has been more focused on patient-focused drug development. And one of those key tools is the use of patient-reported outcomes or PROs. And in this slide, just sort of flag a couple of reasons why, in terms of making sure that the drug works or the therapy works as intended. We know that patients with the same disease and same treatment can have different experiences. There are cultural differences that can shape how symptoms are reported, perceived, and expressed. And from an FDA regulatory perspective, where this comes in especially is how the PROs are stipulated or addressed in approved labeling. And so it's really important to think about, from a FDA regulatory perspective, what your intended use of the PRO is. What is the regulatory purpose that you intend it to serve? So there are PROs that can, as Michael was sort of summarizing, that can address efficacy, safety or tolerability. And an interesting area is preference, for example, different dosage forms. An area that has been really sort of an exciting area that industry, I think, has been focused on over the years, certainly accelerated over the past couple of years with the ongoing pandemic, and an area where there's been a lot of progress and thinking within the agency as part of the area sort of priority kind of initiatives that I've been focused on while I was at the agency, is really sort of leveraging these digital tools, these as digital health technologies that, you know, started as EHRs, electronic signatures sort of earlier on, but now is becoming a lot more sophisticated in remote acquisitions to data acquisition, to tools like wearables and alerts, where if you're thinking about, you know, an oncology drug development program, there are a lot more meaningful time points where you can generate or obtain data about how the patient's doing on the drug, not just, you know, while at the hospital. So it can be very important from a development program perspective, but also just from a patient quality of life perspective. Just some considerations that are really important to consider when thinking about how to integrate remote data acquisition tools like DHTs. It's the level of verification. So how do you make sure that the system works and is reliable, and the data that comes out of that are good, that it's, you know, the quality of data supports what you're trying, what you want it to show, and that the records and the you know, the basis behind it, that when it's submitted, or if it were submitted to FDA to support an approval, FDA could easily verify that, or that there wouldn't be any sort of concerns with gaps in that data. If we could move over to slide 10.
So Lowell, while we do that, let me ask a question, and maybe this is what you're going to get into on the next slide, which is, when do you raise this with FDA? And how do you start that discussion?
Sure. Well, I'd say the earlier the better. Early engagement, early meaningful engagement with FDA is really, really crucial, especially when thinking about more innovative digital tools. One thing that was really interesting to me when I was at the agency was with these innovative initiatives, real world data, which we're going to talk about next more broadly, and digital tools, are that the agency doesn't have a lot of experience with it, and so is relying on the industry to help them think through the process. And so early on engagement from, you know, early clinical trials as that's being integrated and sort of verifying through, you know, your ongoing regulatory meetings can be really, really important. And so certainly before implementation and planning is a best practice, definitely.
And did I read your last slide to mean that the FDA actually has, if you wanted to use a digital health technology to record patient, reported outcomes data as you go through the treatment or use of the product, that there's sort of there's a rubric for getting the technologies approved, and there are certain technologies that have already been approved. So if you are a developer that wants to do that, there might be a technology that's off the shelf or that's already been approved that you can use. And if it's not there, if you want to use that technology and have the FDA rely on it, you actually have to make sure that they've agreed that that is technology that meets their standards.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for flagging that. And right, I mean, that gets at sort of what tool do you want to use, and is it out there? Is it classified by the agency as a device, and has it gone through the clearance or approval process, or is it something that's not commercially marketed and is used as an in-house, you know, drug discovery or development tool? And the latter, right, I mean, gets at you know, sort of the more novel, for example, if it's a novel biomarker, what data, what studies you've run to make sure that it's doing what it's intended.
Great, thanks.
Sure, thanks, Alice. So starting with slide 10 here, and just sort of taking it up a little level of from patient-generated data more broadly with real-world data and real-world evidence. So the focus here this is sort of in tandem with the use of digital tools, but we've really seen a shift towards patient-generated data and outcomes, and especially, which we'll talk a little bit in the next slide about companion diagnostics and the personalized medicine space. But there's been a lot of discussion and increasing attention on the use of real-world evidence in regulatory decision-making. And I think that industry is sort of looking for FDA for a lot more guidance that's specific and applicable to disease, disease or serious diseases or conditions. The agency has been focused on data sets and sources, so FDA has issued guidance on this, but just really sort of top-line considerations, again, as you're thinking about, as part of your development program, running a RWE study or linking it with your RCT. Questions are, the fit for use of the data, the relevance and reliability, which sort of now kind of pulls at the digital tools that you're using, and how does it fit into the trial or study design? And that gets at the relevance. And again, as Alice raises, does the study meet FDA's regulatory requirements as you're submitting it to support approval? An important piece here is FDA is really focused on this area and initiative. So it's an area where policies are continuing to evolve. For example, there are several ongoing pilot studies that are supported by FDA as part of the agency's effort internally to learn more about how best to leverage real-world data in sort of the real-world setting. If we could move to slide 11, please. The next slide is on companion diagnostics and access, and I wanted to take some time to discuss some important considerations when you're accessing the market through companion diagnostics, and what that looks like in terms of your strategic planning, and early on discussions. So at baseline, a companion diagnostic is a diagnostic that's provides information that's essential to ensure the drug or therapy is safe and effective. And with that, it's included or stipulated in your approved labeling. So it's really important to consider early on what that's going to look like, almost end to end, because when you're working with a diagnostic, it's what are you measuring? Is it a predictive biomarker? Is it an indication that's the current standard of care, meaning that you go to your physician and they run their normal battery of tests and they're measuring it at that time. But then also, what are the platforms being used? Again, so for example, if you're using a digital sort of tool early on for screening, how all that sort of connects and how that you can really ensure that, one, the diagnostic performs and is reliable. And when you're thinking about the end-to-end framework for the use of companion diagnostic, it's really important to consider your partnerships and development approaches. Is this you have a co-development partner? Is it a companion diagnostic that's already on the market that's sort of a CMO-ish or something else? And where that becomes really important to consider is when you're moving through your development program, as Michael's walking through those considerations from phase 1 to post, is you're going from an investigational product early on, not a lot of production, to thinking about really sort of ramping up and certainly for less so for those rare sort of conditions, but you're ramping up production. And oftentimes what we've kind of worked with companies that have been early on discovery that have used LDTs, and the framework, one of laboratory developed tests is very much evolving as part of things that we're really watching with as user fee legislation progresses. But thinking about sort of moving from LDT, which is CMS regulated, to the companion diagnostic and scaling up, and thinking about what studies you need to sort of bridge the gap, because there are important differences, and you don't want to get too far in your development program, too close to the approval date, and having to think about, well, we need to run some studies, and this is going to delay us. You want to be ahead of that early on.
So Lowell, we heard in the first session that among other watchouts on companion diagnostics is also making sure that the electronic health record that your providers will use, it actually accommodates that test and will report the data, and there's a field for it. So there's some very nuts and bolts issues that go with it. But Michael, I'd be interested in how the payer looks at companion diagnostics when a developer comes in.
Yeah, Alice, thanks for that question. You know, when we look at companion diagnostics as a payer, we really like these components or these tests being linked to the binary yes or no patient response to drug. So it's part of the FDA approval process that helps identify the patient who will respond and does respond. So very yes-no decision-making points. We have a little bit of a challenge with diagnostic test or companion diagnostic test when it's a better versus poor responder. Because how do we as a payer say no to those who may be negative if they only have a 30% response, but those who are positive may have 60? It's very difficult for us to kind of define that or limit that. So we're more encouraged where it's a very binary component like ALK, HER2, EGFR, things that we've seen that are very binary yes or no decision points. Now, a companion diagnostics that is used as part of a diagnostic panel and helps create a treatment algorithm for a rare disease or oncology and is supported through compendia, that is something we can help support and get our heads around, and also be aligned to formulary coverage and the allowance of the test to be performed by that physician when requested for the patient.
Thanks. Back to you, Lowell.
Great. Thank you. Just another consideration before we wrap this slide is I wanted to flag important planning for just the review process. When you're working with a companion diagnostic, you're involving multiple parts of the agency that sometimes play nice together, but sometimes don't, and so it's important to know that and to plan for that. There are ultimately same mission, but there may be different concerns that either center, whether it's the device center or the biologic or drug center, may raise. So it's important, again, to get ahead of that as you're planning and making sure that as you assemble your team early, you have the right folks. So you have important folks, those folks making the decision at the table at that time. If we could move to slide 12. There's a lot on this slide, and I'll cover it high level, and I'm happy to discuss in more detail. But there's just been a lot of focus on confirmatory trials, and that's in part through expedited pathways, for example, like the accelerated approval program that allows sponsors to obtain approval based on initial evidence or a limited set of data, with a condition that you'll run this study post-approval to verify, confirm the safety and efficacy. There has been a lot of attention on the study design and whether the data are meaningful, and also, FDA sort of framework of what to do if the data aren't so great. And so an area that is important to watch as these programs are really very much I think evolving. There's efforts to sort of strengthen the program, change the program. So it's important as you're going through this, preparing for submission, it may be at that point as you're engaging with the agency to understand really what the expectations are for example, how detailed you need in terms of your submission for the protocol for your confirmatory trial, and whether that needs to be underway, and how that update or reporting should be submitted to the agency. So with that, I appreciate the opportunity, and I will turn it back over to, I'll turn this over to Peter to share his thoughts on cost effectiveness.
Great. Thank you very much. Awesome your presentation so far. So I love listening and learning as well. But today, as you've heard about some strategies about how to get ahead of the FDA plan, PBM, regulatory product and formulate cycles. But I want to talk to you today about how you should convey the value of the product you're developing to a broader audience prior to launch. Health economists, governments, patients, their families, and society as a whole. As you can see on slide 14, health economists have identified several ways to understand an innovation's value. It's called the ISPOR value flower, and encourage you to check out ISPOR's work. But unfortunately, if you look at slide 15, health economists are with a simple focus of how does this innovation fit into my health plan or government budget or political agenda. They are basically evaluating your innovation, whether you realize it or not, from that limited perspective. Before you come to market, government entities like NICE in the UK, CADIF in Canada, or private entities like ICER in the US are going to try and frame the value of your medicine for you. They do this by performing so-called cost effectiveness analysis. But the problem is that the underlying math equation that they're using excludes a ton of values the medicine provides to payers, patients, their families, and societies as a whole. So not surprisingly, they use a simple math to defend the parochial needs and claim that the value of the innovation is not worth its likely market price. This faulty math that just uses these limited values is then seized upon by payers and opponents of innovation to not only claim that your innovation is not worth it, but to fuel stories that call into question both your science and your motives. So all of a sudden, this market access strategy, it's well thought out with payers, with FDA, all of a sudden it's challenged by arbitrary health economists using faulty, simple math. So my point today is not that you should not approach cost effectiveness based solely off of this flat earth approach to innovation's value. Because the math is skewed from the start with this equation to make the case that your innovation is not worth its likely market price. And if you look at slide 16, you can see that over time, the market price is always above what cost-effective analysis have used. Using this simple math, have basically shown that the CEAs are coming in at less than the market price because they're using this limited type of math to define the product. So it's up to you to make sure that economists are running better math and factor in values that are ignored. And if you look at slide 17 and 18, all of a sudden you can see that if you start adding in real world values like genericization, the fact that the product is going to go generic, the fact that the innovation is going to have spillovers where it reduces sort of the family caregiver burden, and it also adds to scientific spillovers. All of a sudden, if you start adding in these real world values that broader health economists have evaluated, as you see slide 19, you can see that that all of a sudden that by using these values, these generalized cost effectiveness values, the societal value of innovation, whether it's incremental or first in class, will be worth its likely market price.
So Peter, I'm just going to ask you to pause there for a minute, because I'm trying to wrap my head around what some of these concepts are, and I want to make sure our audience does. Can you dig into what you mean by genericization and the value of that?
So right now, a simple math will not take into account that your product will go generic at a date certain. Most likely, if it's not a complex biologic, but if you're, say, a Vertex Trikafta, that product is go generic within, say, 12 years. 12 to 16 years is the sort of the standard. And so, but their math assumes that the market price is going to be the WAC for perpetuity. So they're not taking into account that the value of this product will be increased substantially over time and create a consumer surplus that's not currently factored into their existing math.
Right. So you'll be able to get it at a generic price and generic copay, $10 potentially in 12 years. and the value to cost ratio is much higher at that point in time. And you're saying sort of create the present value of that when you're looking at the value of the product today.
Correct. And to look at it from this broader sort of value perspective, you don't necessarily, on slide 19, it's not just you jam in every single value into a study, but you do want to be able to point to a few others beyond the traditional ICER one. And so what we're doing actually is so we're doing it at NPLB and recommend you do as well, is that we're developing these GCA studies to substantiate and prime the pump of this broader math, so that when you approach CEA firms, as part of your phase 3 process, likely they'll know how to quantify and add these values that relate to your products more specifically. And so, for example, we're going in and recalculating ICER's Trikafta model, and we're going to be able to show that once you add in values like genericization, population growth, and caregiver spillover, that ICER would have found, had they added these values, that the market price was well worth its value. And we're not suggesting, once again, that you price your products at the societal value, but you do want to help frame the debate between what ICER and NICE are going to frame your product as being not worth its value versus the societal value, so that you can actually have your market price reflect all of the factors that Mike and Lowell just talked about. So lastly, this issue of how the U.S. government should reimburse you for drugs is not just a legislative issue; it's a regulatory issue. It's this concept of, is it reasonable and necessary for Medicare to cover it, and at what price should it reimburse it, regardless of what happens with the FDA process. So once again, as you get closer to bringing your innovation to market, I encourage you to consider adding a few of these values to the CEA studies that you fund. And I'm happy to talk offline, or urge you to check out our website to learn more in detail about what we're doing and how we're trying to sort of vaccinate against bad math and start making sure that folks look at your innovation's value with a broader societal value.
So Peter, it sounds to me like if you're looking at the patient journey and the patient experience, because we are all doing what we do to help patients in whatever therapeutic areas we're studying. In those conversations, you're going to hear about what really matters to them, or why this treatment, how this impacts their life, and that would inform value. And then it sounds like NPLB might be a place where developers could go to maybe get a little bit of support about, okay, this is what we're hearing from our patients. How do we turn that into a study on value? Who do we use? How do you frame it? Because it sounds like you're further advanced maybe than others in how to frame and how to look at that.
Yeah, we have 4 sort of GCA research projects underway using two firms, the Analysis Group and Precision HEOR, and we're happy to connect you with them. And once again, it's more about, it sounds so silly, but you have these arbitrary budget-focused economists who are separate from this regulatory process and separate from the PBM plan process, who are evaluating whether or not your innovation is worth it.
And how do you use
and
this?
They're using.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
This. I don't know if I broke up there or not, but they're using limited math, and so to the extent that as you're doing your CA, you start incorporating this broader math, that'll allow you to have a better discussion, not only with your potential payers, but also the broader, the patients and families, as well as broader sort of societal debate about whether or not innovations are worth it in general.
So I can see how you would use those data with Medicare and Medicaid, because they don't have that 2-year event horizon that Michael talked about, right? Because Medicaid maybe, but not so much Medicare. Once you're on Medicare, you're on Medicare. So Michael, best case, how does a payer react? What's the best way to frame this and try to get any traction with a payer that has a 2-year time frame to think about this?
Alice, this is a really, really interesting question. So anytime we look at ICER, we do peruse their report and understanding of how they, did their modeling, their cost of value equation. And, tongue in cheek, we will use it to our advantage when the price is lower than the list price through negotiation component, of course. And we usually stay silent when it's either higher or justifiable, because I work for payers and PBMs. We try to leverage, negotiate, and drive down drug pricing as much as possible. The future of ICER and these governing bodies, I think, is developing. As you mentioned, Medicaid states, maybe traditional Medicare, who are going to make coverage determinations based off of this, will start spilling over into some of the commercial environment. But I think we're still at its infancy stage. Some of these reports take a little bit of time to come to the market. They take a little bit of time to develop. They really are post when a payer is wanting to engage with that manufacturer and or make their decision for how they want to cover the drug already. Now, we can always revisit and enhance coverage or reevaluate the product or category as new information becomes available. But right now, we like to think we are nice, and that's the adjective, not the entity. So we don't use quality here in the United States, unfortunately. And we don't really incorporate a lot of ICER decision-making into our P&T and or formulary decision-making at this time.
Peter, if I'm a early stage company and I've got one product and it's like all I can do to just prove it's safe and effective, I hear this and it sounds great, but I don't even know where to start. I don't know if that's where I should spend my limited time and resources. Lowell's nodding too. Like, how do you help them?
Well, I think I don't think this is a phase 1 issue, first of all. I do think it more of as a phase 3 issue when you're doing confirmatory trials, and one in which you're probably going to be asked at some point to do a cost effectiveness analysis and to add in a few of the values that are clearly, relate to your product and innovation. So that's, I think, the first thing is that it's not your job to over-engineer or overthink this. It's really about to make sure that if you're going to do a CEA, that you're incorporating a few of these values beyond what traditional ICER or NICE math is, because the worst thing that can happen to you is not so much whether or not the folks at United Healthcare or Aetna read the ICER report and use it or not use it. But all of a sudden, if there's a news story that comes out that says, Alice's new drug, she wants to charge $1 million per dose, but ICER, the gold standard of payers and math and a health economist, says it only is worth $2. That this Alice's product is not worth it, and you should really be looking at alternatives. And that, I think is just as disruptive to your launch strategy as is, not making sure you're following and getting ahead of the product cycle with the plan or the FDA cycle, early on, as soon as possible, even taking it as a critical path process and FDA regulatory process.
And if I could add to that, I agree. I mean, the confirmatory studies, are focused on the clinical setting and verifying safety and effectiveness, if it were through an expedited pathway. But there's been a lot of thinking of how to link that with real world data studies that one can support, patient voice and quality of life, that potentially could lead to expanded indications and just broader sort of, cost effectiveness, I think, as well. And so it's really helpful to think about, how the data supports, an FDA regulatory decision-making process, but the data can enrich or support or inform or guide other decisions that could support the overall value proposition.
I also think that if you are going to use a new category of value in the value flower, or something that is not standard, I guess I would say, in the typical cost-effective analysis, it's incumbent upon you to start defining that as part of the value early, because it's going to take some time to change minds and to change the narrative and the typical framework people bring. And as I look at slide 19, and I look at things like the value of hope, the fear of contagion, the value of knowing, which to me strike me as very much about the patient and family experience around a disease, and frankly, the mental health benefits of therapy. That is something that you would want to make sure, is critical to the value of it, but also something that you need to introduce early in framing the discussion about the value and what this brings. possibly with some savings, particularly if there are mental health costs associated with treating the patient or their family because of the anxiety that might be around the treatment and the disease, but also to measure it. But again, as the audience will have heard, there's a lot of focus here on starting early and thinking about it early. And another theme that we've had since the first session is making purposeful decisions about what you focus on, recognizing that when you're developing a product and you have, a finite amount of resources and personal time to develop to it, or to devote to the product's development, it's much better. And what we're trying to do through this series is make sure that you are making purposeful decisions about what you're focusing on, when you're engaging, how you're framing the product, as opposed to being boxed in at the end because you haven't thought about it. So this series is about flagging a bunch of things so that you can figure out, here are the choices I have for what to focus on and what to spend time and money on. This is how I'm going to do that, not only for your own decision making, but to the extent you're encountering investors and they're asking those questions, you can demonstrate to the investors, we've thought about it and made a purposeful decision, as opposed to never thought about it, don't care, whatever. They at least know that you have made judgments and have considered those factors going forward. So with that, I think we're about to the Q&A section. Over to you, Sarah.
Am I on screen, everybody? I'm back. Okay. We have quite a few that have come in, and some of them are rather lengthy. So let me ask a couple of quick ones. One of them is, what is the quicker withdrawal process? So I don't know where we were in the discussion when that particular question came in.
I think that might be for me with some considerations or things that we're watching with respect to, for example, the accelerated approval pathway. Some of the discussion is around how to to streamline the process if a confirmatory study were not to verify the safety or effectiveness, or what that approach looks like. The current process is a lengthy one with notice and some discussion, and it's slower. And so the discussion is about how to, if there is a pathway to potentially, withdraw the product faster.
Okay, Lo, let's stick with you for a minute. One of our viewers said that she is very surprised that PROs is being cited as an important indicator. And she wanted to know if you can cite examples of drugs that use them and that this resulted in payer advantages. Sure.
Well, I think there's an FDA. There's been a couple of webinars and presentations that just really focus on PROs in labeling, and especially around oncology drugs. For example, there was a recent guidance about just that, where it's really interesting, an area of where, when I was mentioning making sure you gauge or level set the regulatory purpose of your PRO, when I mentioned, safety and tolerability and effectiveness, but then there are also examples of drugs where there's some preference discussion, where, for example, a change to a dosage form.
Okay.
Sarah, this is Michael. Can I add my payer lens on that same question?
Absolutely, Michael.
So when we look at patient-reported outcomes, these are usually subjective endpoints, and as the question alluded, we as payers, PBMs, do not put a lot of value in those types of quantifiable statistics. So to Lowell's comments, we are always going to be looking at efficacy endpoints first, safety, tolerability, discontinuation, and price. If we get to a point where we're having one drug versus another, and one of these drugs do have PRO, FDA-approved diagnostic assessments included in their endpoints, that can push it past the finish line, because it has something more that illustrates there is something unique to why patients either taking this more frequently, adhering to it better, or just liking it and not running into challenges with maintenance of medication. So we don't ever want to say we're not looking at them. They're just more tertiary compared to anything else that's going to be discussed at a P&T in today's formulary tactic modeling.
Okay. Thank you so much, Michael. Anybody else want to comment, Alice?
Lowell, I was just going to say, you mentioned webinars. Are those things that the FDA has put on that the audience could find on their website if they wanted to watch that?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's in tandem with the release of that guidance that I mentioned.
Great.
Okay, great. Let's move on to another question. One of our viewers has an orphan designation for a repurposed drug. The drug is a generic product that is currently prescribed off-label in this disease area. If their NDA gets approved, we will be the only approved drug using the substance for this rare disease. Since our pricing will be substantially higher due to the small number of patients in this patient population group, how will the payers view this type of scenario?
Michael, yeah.
Yeah, so it is. So apparently it's being used off-label right now in this disease area, but they're getting it approved for this specific rare disease.
All right, I see the question, and I'm following the ask specifically. So think about how a payer is going to look at this. So if it's a generic, multi-sourced, most likely does not have any prior authorization criteria, covered at a low copay tier, it's probably already being used today, and we may or may not even know it, depending upon what other indications truly this drug has. And if it is viewed as a standard of care and or compendia listed or peer-reviewed through the physician community as an effective drug for this condition, an FDA-approved reformulation is going to have a very difficult time getting PBM and payer support. Because we have treatment options there. The molecule's the same. What you're going to have to try to illustrate is, do you have any head-to-head data that shows what makes you different? Is it because it's absorbed quicker? It has less safety and tolerability aspects of it. It's slowing progression, because this hill will be quite steep. Knowing that if a generic is out there now and it's not on our radar today, and it's being used as an effective standard of care, and you come out with the same molecule in an FDA-approved product that's hundreds of thousands of dollars, being its orphan drug, it's going to come across with a lot of skepticism from P&T decision makers.
So, Michael, would that be a situation where if you had a different formulation, for example, or different strengths, something that might help differentiate it if there's clinical data support that's appropriate?
Yeah, strengths, route of administration, or different strengths could definitely help. I mean, we don't want an oral disintegrating tablet versus an oral capsule, but I mean, if something, you need to illustrate something that's going to make it meaningfully different as to why this orphan population is going to respond better with this product.
Okay. Thank you so much, Michael. On to another question from an international viewer. Are there restrictions to be considered on what kind of data on a pre-approval product candidate can be discussed with PBMs in order that companies, don't run afoul of FDA rules around communications, which could be considered promotional?
Sarah, I'll take this again. Let others chime in if they've heard anything else. I have not heard of any specific regulations that are going to restrict what a manufacturer and a PBM or payer can discuss. They've even recently, in the last, I believe it was 2 years plus now, have allowed the list and net pricing discussions occur pre-approval. Now, every manufacturer has to look at their own tolerability of risk and disclosing how much information they would be permitted to give based on their own compliance and legal team. But we have always provided feedback on our expectations using benchmarks, analogs, other therapeutic categories, or just overall clinical value to help provide guidance back to that manufacturer to help it be successful.
Yeah, I think this is in line with one of our other questions that came in, about around when a company should start speaking to payers and PBMs. So, thank you.
If I could add quickly to that one, FDA has a lot of guidance and thinking. There's been a lot of thinking about what is promotion of an unapproved drug in that setting for discussions with PBM. So it's, as part of what Michael's mentioning, really important to discuss early on what that looks like. Really in as granular as you can of what specifically will be discussed and how to make sure that you're within bounds.
Okay, thank you. Here is another question that may not be completely in line with this discussion. What is the typical time frame for a post-phase 3 company to start a confirmatory trial? I heard that it can be as long as 8 years.
It can be some time afterwards, and that's as part of the efforts to improve these program associated with that leads to confirmatory trials is sort of the transparency of what's provided to FDA and when those studies are start. Some discussions have been even to the point of, do we require these confirmatory studies to have started by the time of approval? So that's a lot of the discussion that's sort of in flight at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to comment? Another question is, please comment on the differences in pricing for a drug in different countries, the US, Canada, China, and Japan. I know you have a crystal ball and can answer that.
I'll just say they're all a creature of the payer systems that they have. We don't have a single payer system here, so there is no price negotiation. You can set your WAC wherever you want, but the key, of course, is to look at gross to net. In the UK, they have a single payer, so that effectively controls price. In most European countries, there's a negotiated price with governments, and so when you have that, that's going to affect it in a way that you just don't have here, at least if you're comparing WAC versus gross to net. Peter, I don't know if you've seen that as well.
Well, I think that the broader point is even more interesting, is that government entities are more than willing to wait and deny access to innovative therapies for their patients until there's an uproar. Trikafta, I think, is just going to be available in Australia, this year after, 2 years after launch. So it's not just a process in terms of what is the rate that NICE, et cetera, is set. It's also, they have a tolerance of denying access to innovative medicines that in the US, oftentimes they do not. I think a payer will often say, we don't want to be the first one or the last one to cover an expensive product. And I think a payer is in a foreign entity is like, we don't mind being the last one to cover this product, unless there's a significant political blowback.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. Another question, and I think this will be a short answer. Can you provide an example of the receptivity to the value flower? This viewer says it sounds nice, but I just can't see receptivity on the payer side.
So a few things. One, that's why we're working on it. But two, first of all, honestly, ISPOR, has been working on this, value flower for a number of years now, and which is a international economics forum. There's a lot of interest, I think, in moving to better understanding the value of medicines. And I think what we care about is that, we are concerned that, payers, not just individual health plans, but in general, are not valuing innovations. And why is that? And part of it is they're basing that discussion off of faulty math. And so rather than complain or say, oh boy, these innovations are incredible, and be less quantitative, is that we've looked at it and found out that the math and the equation that entities are using is very simple and don't reflect that innovation's true value. And there are real world, just like there's real world evidence that's going to be incorporated into the FDA approval process. We think there should be real world values that go into the entity's view of the value of a medicine. And once again, not suggesting that a price of a product should incorporate the societal value as a whole, but it should at least be able to push back against the limited math so that you can really feel confident about your market price.
Okay, thank you.
I would just add to Michael's point earlier, this may not be relevant to every product, but for some products, the way of framing the value of the product is going to be different from the status quo cost effectiveness study. And the point is for developers to be sensitive to whether their product is one of those, and then own the responsibility to reframe that discussion if you really want to claim the value for the product that you want to price it at. Because it won't change unless you push it to change.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Peter. One of our viewers asks for an orphan or rare indication where 50% of patients are covered by Medicaid. Where do you start your phase 1 payer engagement? CMS? Question mark.
I'll take that to say I think you can. I think it's also state Medicaid directors, right? So I think CMS, the Division of Pharmacy, they're largely pharmacists by training. They love hearing about new products, and so letting them know that it's coming, particularly if it's really going to be a game changer in terms of treatment, is always helpful. I think they're always interested in particularly if it's going to have a large budgetary impact. And then separate for that, I would start talking to state Medicaid directors in key states so that they're aware it's coming.
Okay,
the only thing I would add to that is, since this question asks 50% of patients are going to be covered potentially by Medicaid, which is dominantly women and children, that's still a commercial environment. So you still want to get in front of the payers too, because there is going to be a percentage or a decent population that will be commercially eligible also, but those demographics.
Okay. And to follow on for this is one of our viewers who was with an association says that it's extremely difficult for biotech startups to approach payers. In my experience, simply not very open to talking with early stage companies. What is your view?
Well, since I'm the payer and the PBM, I would always say if you walk in the door with a 90% rebate, we'll talk to anybody. Being facetious, though. Now, how to engage early is there's a couple different aspects we can go down, different paths. One, we could look at just designing and developing advisory boards with some of the key payer communities or ex-payers to help you frame how we would be thinking collectively to make sure you do it right as you develop. Advisory boards work well. Number two, yes, you may not have a market access team. This goes back to Alice's question earlier, but we may have to use some of our relationships, whether it's within the industry or within folks like who are on the calls today, and Alex and others, or myself, to help bridge some opportunity to at least get an audience or an introductory type of conversation. And then last but not least, there's national meetings, whether those are the AMCPs, the PCMAs, the Assemblias, getting there, making yourselves known, announcing who you are as an organization, maybe doing some posters or even some small speaking bureaus where you can get in front of some of these folks to say, look, we'd like to engage you early in the process. We want you to be a partner. We want to do this right. So let us use your guidance to help walk us through this process.
That sounds like great advice. Great advice.
So we have to look at 3 different ways or all 3 at once, because you're right. If you don't have a market access team and you're so early in your development, you sometimes need to try to engage the payer from multiple different angles.
Okay, great. 2 very quick questions, and then it will be time for us to wrap up. One of them is, can you explain durability of benefit?
That was me.
Okay.
I commented on that. Durability of benefit is basically duration of your trial. How long are you tracking the outcome of this patient? If a patient responds quickly or onset of action, we want to make sure that that patient who does respond can stay and respond. We don't want to see some waning effect or dose creep that's going to require either a request to go above the FDA label, maybe adding on some polypharmacy or adjunctive treatments. Durability of benefit illustrates controlled patients longer term.
Okay, great. And then our final question is, are there any special considerations that a company should keep in mind if they have a study done outside of the U.S.? Are there any special hurdles they should look out for? Alice, I see you shaking your head. Yes.
No, I think that's for Lowell first, probably.
Okay, Lowell.
Sure. Well, important considerations, definitely, and that's making sure that there is a regulation of foreign clinical studies. That, but ultimately, there are important considerations, good clinical practice sort of considerations for those studies, because the data, if they are supporting a product for approval in the U.S., should meet that same, threshold. And certainly there's been a lot of attention more recently with respect to exclusively foreign clinical studies. So that's an important consideration to think about in terms of diversity and study data.
Okay, yeah, I just want to let you know, Michael, that the same viewer came in and asked again about durability of benefit. So it's all the way down at the bottom of the Q&A list again. So I'm glad that we specifically discussed it again. With that said, I think it's time for us to wrap up. And Alice and Michael, Lowell, Peter, do you have any final words for the audience, for the viewers, that you would like to share? Why don't we start with Michael first and go to Lowell, Peter, and then Alice finally.
No, Sarah, the only thing I want to add is thank you very, very much for the opportunity, guys. I really enjoyed this opportunity to present to you, how to work with a payer early on, how to engage in the process, how to help understand what a payer is going to be looking for in order to make not just the P&T decision effectively, but also provide a manufacturer the most efficient way to ensure appropriate access based on the outcomes of your trials.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michael. Lowell?
Sure, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity as well. Appreciate sharing my perspectives on more innovative or different ways of measuring effectiveness and value from an FDA regulatory perspective, and now seeing sort of the integration of these sort of digital tools and different data sets to drive drug development is an exciting space and one that we're watching really closely.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Lowell. Peter?
Once again, thank you, Sarah, Alice, and everybody who patiently sat through this session. It's great to virtually see everyone, but I do just want to highlight that in addition to the product process at a plan and the regulatory process with the agency, to really start thinking ahead of how is my innovation going to be perceived in the marketplace, and what are the things, and how do we make sure we're defining it for ourselves and not letting arbitrary economists we've never heard of before define it for us. And happy to help think that through as you're developing your CEA studies. Go to No Patient Left Behind, email me, phone me. Happy to help sort of think through some of these issues, because we are trying to change the debate so that folks look at the societal value of the therapies that you're working on, not just the sort of budgetary perspective.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you. Alice?
Peter, I can attest you are a wonderful thinking partner when it comes to those things. So I endorse that and encourage you to engage with him. What I'll end with is to just remind folks that you can do this. I recognize that as you're developing your products, really making sure that you get over the line with FDA is, of course, the top priority. And this can seem complicated and hard with a lot of shifting sands and changing rules, and then future states, which are going to look at things that you don't even know how to look at yet. And the point of our 3 sessions, and I encourage you to look at the slides and listen to them if you have time, is you can do it. You can just make purposeful decisions, but let's make them purposeful decisions so that you know the trade-offs you're making to best position and create options for you to ensure not only that the product gets approved, but that the patients that you serve can actually access it in a meaningful and affordable way. And that's why planning early is the best way to go. Thanks, Sarah.
Alice, great final words, great words of encouragement for all of our viewers. So I do want to just say a special thanks to you, Alice, for proposing this concept of doing this series of 3 salons. They are so, all 3 of them for all of our viewers are really information packed, really important information for any innovative drug developer who is planning to hopefully commercialize and also to raise money, because you need to understand your market access in order to raise money, especially in today's market. So the first 2 salons are currently on our website. You can go out and view them on demand. Any of the slides from those salons are also available. This salon will be posted later today, as I mentioned earlier. And I believe the slides are already up there. I know that I got 2 notes that we missed slide 15. You will find it in the slide deck up there. And with that said, Alice Hogan-Levels, thank you so much. Peter, thank you. Lowell, thank you. Michael, thank you so much. To our audience, please join us at our next virtual salon. It will be posted on our website, and or you will receive an email about it. With that said, goodbye, everybody.